Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next session of our Spotlight on GitHub Copilot series, Prompt Engineering 101. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenter. Damien, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, really good to be here remotely, whether it's your evening, afternoon, if you're in the US, or first thing in the morning in Australia, if you want to kick off with some Copilot. So yes, I'm Damien Brady. I work at GitHub. And I previously worked at Microsoft for a number of years in the DevRel team there, talking about DevOps a lot. So it's not too much of a departure to talk about kind of the inner loop of DevOps and how tools like GitHub Copilot can improve your productivity and make you more effective. So today I am going to talk about Prompt Engineering 101, and this is kind of key to getting the best out of GitHub Copilot. A lot of people have used it, and I have heard a lot of feedback from people saying, look, it never really gives me the response that I want, or I have to change the code that it gives me a lot. And those are legitimate complaints, but just like any other tool, it works better if you are really experienced and really know how to use it the best. So that's what we're going to focus on today, how to use GitHub Copilot as well as we possibly can. All right, so first question, obviously, is prompt engineering. And it's worth, even though this is a fairly common term these days with the growth of large language models and generative AI, it's really important to kind of understand what that means. And I think the best way to demonstrate that is not actually with Copilot at all, but with something else. So I'm just going to switch to, this is github.com. This is my profile. But one of the things we announced fairly recently was a tool called GitHub Models. Now, this is not actually Copilot. This is part of the GitHub Marketplace. And if you go to the Marketplace in your profile, you can see there's Copilot extensions, which I'll get to in a little bit. But there's also this Models section. And so models are basically a way for you to try out a bunch of large language models and small language models to build them into your applications in a really easy way. Now, I'm not going to go into that kind of use case, but it's useful to show you what I mean by prompt engineering. So let's choose one. I won't choose one at random. I'll choose one I kind of know. And you can see there's a lot of them available. These are all actually backed by Azure. So these are OpenAI models that are all living on Azure, I think with the exception of a couple come from OpenAI as well. So there's OpenAI ones, and then there's also Lambda and Mistral and a whole bunch of other ones. But I'm going to use OpenAI GPT-4 Mini, 4.0 Mini. Now, in this marketplace, you can say things like, can you write some code to generate a random number? And now this is not Copilot. This is just a large language model. This is 4.0 Mini. And you can see that it does a pretty good job. It's actually done it in a bunch of different languages. So we've got it in Java, JavaScript, Python. And so, right from here, we can kind of get the response we want. But if we were working in JavaScript, for example, the rest of this is pretty redundant to us. So we can use the ability to give some additional prompts. So what we could do is we could specify, can you give me this code in JavaScript? But you could also do this as a system prompt. So this is some additional context that you're giving to the large language model to help it give you an answer that you actually want. So if I said something like in the system prompt, you're a helpful coding agent that prefers JavaScript, and then ask that question again. Let's just scroll up so I can copy and paste. Ask that same question again. Can you write some code for a random number generator. And because it knows it prefers JavaScript, we've given it that extra context, then it's given us an answer in JavaScript. You could even say something like, you only ever give the code, no explanations, and give it more and more context about what you want it to give you. And that response now will be, here's just the code. Right? So the more context we're giving it, the more information it has in order to answer our questions appropriately. This is actually quite fun to play with. You can do things like, answer with a pirate. Oops. And yeah, so there you go. Here'd be some code to generate a random number in JavaScript. Slightly less useful, obviously, if you're writing some code. Oh, wow, if you've even got emojis, impressive. But the point is, the more information we can give it about what we actually want, the better our response is going to be. So let's think about that in the context of GitHub Copilot. If we are starting with a blank file and we say, write some code to do this, it's got no context about what language we want or what other functions are in our application. And part of the power of GitHub Copilot is being able to gather that information, that relevant information, and send it up to the large language model that's behind GitHub Copilot and get a response back. So we'll have a look at that in practice and how you can use these kind of prompt engineering techniques to get a better result from GitHub Copilot. Just quickly, a little bit on Copilot. We're going to be using primarily the Visual Studio Code IDE here, or editor here, and we're going to use inline Copilot, or what we generally call kind of ghost text, or the original Copilot, where it's like autocomplete on steroids. But we're also going to use chat, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about things like copilotin.com, so Copilot in GitHub.com, and a little bit about some of the things that are coming in the future or have been announced and are coming for people as well. So this all started, Copilot went GA, generally available in June 2022, but we actually kind of started about a year before that with some kind of private previews and internal previews and things like that. So it's been around for a while. This tool has matured, and part of that maturity is being able to build context and build more appropriate information to send back to Copilot on the server to get better and better results. And one of the metrics that we follow really, really closely on Copilot is acceptance rate. So one of the great things about Copilot is if you are using Copilot Business or Copilot Enterprise licenses, we don't use any of the prompts that get sent or any of the code that gets sent to Copilot or any of the responses we give you to train Copilot or to improve that. And in fact, if you're using Copilot individuals, that's just a checkbox in settings to say, don't use any of this information to train Copilot to get better at giving those responses. But one thing we do is we look at acceptance rates. So given a particular version of Copilot and a particular version of the code that builds the context and sends it up, when we send you a response, how likely are you to accept that response? And so we can do that without looking at any of the code at all, just the methods behind how we construct that prompt to send up to the large language model, and how to and what comes back, and then whether you've accepted that or not. And then after a little while, have you kept that code around or have you deleted it? So that acceptance rate gives us a really good metric of whether we're building appropriate context as we go. So yeah, June 2022 was when Copilot Individual GA'd. Business was December 22, and then February 23. And then we've got Copilot Chat going generally available in December 2023. And then this year, we've got things like Copilot Enterprise, which gives you a bit more control over your organization's use of Copilot. And then we've started releasing things like Copilot Chat, went GA for JetBrains. And there's a few more announcements that we've made since. I'll also mention that at the end of October is our GitHub Universe conference. And there will almost certainly be some more announcements about the Copilot at that event. You can live stream that if you want as well, if you go to githubuniverse.com. So keep an eye out for that. Well, what we're going to be focusing on today is kind of two implementations of it primarily. One is the original kind of GitHub Copilot. It's the one that gives you code suggestions, contextualized to your project. So what you're looking at the moment. So if I'm in a TypeScript file, like the one that's on the right, and I ask or put a comment in to say, write a function to do this, the suggestion, or in the case of what's on the right of the screen, an async function is positive. When I hit enter, Copilot's going to take the context of the fact that we're in a TypeScript file, that the name of the function I've just said is positive, and it's going to give me kind of an appropriate response in that language according to that function, the comment that's above it. So it's using all of that context to give me an appropriate response. This means that it's really good for doing things like converting comments to code. So when you have comments, it predicts the code that you want next. It also copies patterns, so auto-filling kind of repetitive code. If you have an example of what you want previously in the file, or even in another file, it can use that context to say, well, this is the pattern that the developer is using to build these bits of code. And so it will copy that pattern and save a lot of keystrokes that way. You can get it to write you tests by saying, hey, write a test for this, and then also show alternatives to what it's suggested. So not just giving you the first suggestion that comes across, but you can actually iterate and have a look through different suggestions that have come back from Copilot on the server as well. When we introduced Copilot Chat, we kind of turned it into more and more of a pair programmer. So we talked about Copilot being an AI pair programmer, but a pair programmer it doesn't just sit there and write code for you based on the comments. It's somebody that you can talk to and bounce ideas off. And so Copilot Chat gave us kind of a chatbot that is aware of the context of our code. So it's more than just a GPT chatbot. It knows what the code we're looking at. You can give it specific files to look at, specific context about what you're asking. And in that case, in that scenario, you can get more and more useful information out of it as well. I'll show you that as well, and we'll start using that too. Now, I just got a question. What would it do if you gave it a file of only comments and instructions to turn this code into a desired language? Would it work? Well, the best way, and I love doing these, the best way to figure this stuff out is to actually try it. So I'll run through a couple of little intro demos first, but a file with only comments and instructions to turn it into code in a desired language. Yeah, let's try it. When we get to the Copilot Chat stuff, I'll show you some inline chat as well. So good question. All right, so here is my Visual Studio Code instance, and I've opened up a data storage class. This is in C#, but Copilot actually works with pretty much any language. How accurate it is with different languages kind of depends on how much training data there was. So it's going to be really good at things like C# and Java and JavaScript and Python, because there's a lot of that on the internet in the training data. But it's going to be less good at things like, I imagine there's a lot of COBOL on there, but probably not as much on the internet as Python or something like that. But obscure languages as well, it can kind of match patterns. And if it's seen some of it, it can do some of a good job, but it's going to be better with more mainstream languages. So this is C#. It's a data storage class that gets products. We've got a function of loading products from JSON, getting all products and adding or updating products. So if I was to say, well, we want a find product function, I can either just start typing this, public, what's it going to return? IEnumerable of product, get products by ID. So you can see it's already starting to predict what I want. So it's not just completing comments and completing code. Anywhere it thinks that it might give me an appropriate suggestion, it's jumping in. So let's say it's product, and then it's find products. And even just typing find, it's predicted, oh, you might expect to find products. Here's a string query. And then to accept that, I can just hit tab. So it's finding all of those that it contains or the description contains, so the name or the description. But if I was to give it some more context on what I want, so let's say I didn't want to actually get it to search by description, I just want it to search by name. I could do that a couple of ways. I could add a comment in here to say, just search by name. So, and then maybe get rid of all of that. And you can see that updated that query. It's suggested I'm just searching by name. Or I could even do something like this, find products by name, and then I'll get rid of the code that's there. And it will say, there you go, find all products by name. So this is giving it some more context about what I actually want. Now, it's worth mentioning as well, this find products by name function, it's using more than just the context of that string, find product by name, products by name. It knows, for example, that this is a C# file. So it knows that that's the language. It also knows that here are the previous functions. Like this is the previous code that's in that file. So even though I typed all of this, IEnumerable by product by name, if I was just to do something like find products by name, it knows that we're using IEnumerables, not an array, because one of the previous functions used IEnumerables. That's a pattern that it can copy. It's got that context from earlier in the file. It's named it find products, given it the name, and it's done that find all as well. It knows things like there is a find all function on that products object because the products object is a list of products. And so it knows a little bit more about the fact that we're using a list. It knows it's C#. There's plenty of training data out there to say what a list generic looks like and what it can do. So it has a lot more context about what we're doing. Now, just to prove this, let's do this in a brand new file, which I can just double click. By the way, if you're interested in Visual Studio Code, you can change the language even if it's not, if you don't have a file saved. So it knows it's C# now. So we have told the editor that this is C#. But if I was to say something like find products by name, we get a really fascinating one. Yeah. So function, but you can see that the lack of context there, it knows we're in a C# file, but it doesn't really know anything else about it. It doesn't know what the rest of it looks like. So if we were to say something like function, there we go. And it's using filter, which is not the same thing we used in the previous one. And in fact, I don't know if that exists. I don't even know what the product object is. It's had a good attempt, but it doesn't have the context of what we've done. What else is in the file, what language we're using, what libraries we're using. However, if I was to open this data storage file, I'm giving Copilot some more context about how I'm writing my code. So if I was to do that again, find products by name using data storage. Let's see if this actually works. Find products by name. So it's using that data storage and calling one of the functions that's in there, I think, and then filtering it based on that. So we've given a little bit more context. This actually is not working the way I expected it to, but if we were to give it like some more context about what the code looks like, and then said we're using data storage. So let's just close some of these, and then try it again. Find products by name. There we go. We've got a little bit more context now because we've given it some more information. It's actually gone even further and added a load and a save too. Now, this might not be exactly what I want. I mentioned earlier that we can iterate through its suggestions. So you can see if I hover over that ghost text, you can see I can accept it by hitting tab. I can accept a word, so just accept a little bit at a time and then let it keep predicting. Or I've got one of three. This is one of three suggestions. So I can say, well, I don't like that one. Let's try the next one. And you can see it's another suggestion that Copilot has given me. Or a list of products. So I can iterate through the options that are available to me as well. Now, the specific question that somebody asked before, sorry, one more thing on that. These are the three suggestions, but I can also hit Control and Enter. So by default, Copilot will just give me a bunch of suggestions. If I hit Control and Enter, that actually opens another window of GitHub Copilot suggestions. And it gives me a lot more information. So here's suggestion 1. It's given me up to 10 suggestions. Here's its first suggestion. And if I want that, I can accept it. Suggestion 2. And they're all going to be slightly different. That one's massive, actually. So suggestion 3 writes the entire class for me, which is fantastic, or suggestion 4. So if I wanted to have a look to see what other options there are and explore it a little bit more deeply than just the ghost text that I can hit tab, I can hit Control and Enter, and it will give me that. All right, let's close this one. The specific question that was asked was if I create a new file and give it some comments and ask for it in a specific language, will it help? Now, right now, I'm not telling it what language to speak to. We kind of did this as well, but let's say we do Python, because I don't think there's any Python in here, and said, I don't know, number class that returns a random number. Now, right now, it doesn't know what language that is or anything like that. I can say Python, or I could save this as a .py file. Let's not bother with that. Now, Copilot, okay, it's suggested between 1 and 1,000. That's probably good. So let's try Control Enter and see what it gives us there. Oops, not one password. You don't want that. So let's import random and randint. So that's his first suggestion. All right, let's just go with that. It said class number in itself and get number. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's here. So it's given us not quite exactly what we want here. But again, the message with anything with Copilot is if it's not giving you what you want, then you need to provide more context. So let's do it over here and say, actually, we want a function returning a random number between 1 and 1,000. There we go. And so because we've given it that context kind of closer to where we need it, it's given us that function. In terms of giving a whole big set of bits of code and asking it to implement them in different languages, because this is kind of an autocomplete on steroids, that's not really the place for that kind of work. But you can get a lot of better results with that kind of thing with Copilot Chat. So let's look a little bit at Copilot Chat. Let's not save that one. Copilot Chat is another extension. Well, it kind of comes with Copilot if you install Copilot, and it's the it's the chat bot basically that helps you kind of have a conversation, not just with the large language model, but with your code as well. So if I was to ask here, can you write a Python file that does the following? And then gave it a list. So returns a random number, returns a random prime, I don't know, checks for if a number is prime. So we're giving it we're asking a big question. And you can see this is a little bit more like the models we were looking at before. And so it's given us a whole file here, which has an isPrime, so it's importing random, an isPrime function, a random number function, and a random prime number function, which is probably not super efficient. It just gets a random number and then checks if it's prime, which is, I don't know, not ideal. But if we wanted to use that file, we've got a few options. We can just insert it at the cursor, which is the one that I tend to use very often. So whenever you see a code block, you can do that. That means it just dumps it in there. Or you can say copy all of this. So if you want to if it gives you a chunk of code and you want to copy it and paste it somewhere else, you can also say insert it into a new file. And then if you've asked a question about something you can run in the terminal, you can ask it to insert that in the terminal. So if you weren't aware, VS Code has a built-in terminal, which you can get to with Control tilde. So the one just to the left of the 1 key and an English American keyboard. So I could get that to paste it into the terminal. It doesn't make sense in this context, but you can do that too. The other one that I really like is relatively new, which is just an apply button. So if I had another function or another class that had a bunch of things in there and said, how can I change this code to be more efficient or something, and it gave me a change. That apply button will apply that change in a more intelligent way rather than just pasting it in blindly. So let's jump back just to test some of this stuff. Let's jump back to our API, our data storage class, and we'll open chat again. You can start a new chat, by the way, which kind of clears this context. This is a conversation, so I can say, is this efficient? And it knows that I'm talking about the previous conversation that we had. So it's actually said, I think it's actually said, no, not terribly efficient. It's even given me like the O of N, O notation complexity as well. So, and given me some suggestions for how to make it more efficient. And now it's using the context of what I've highlighted here, by the way, rather than the previous conversation. But if I hadn't opened that file, it would have continued the conversation. Anyway, let's start a new chat. This clears the context to say I'm talking about a brand new thing now. If I was to say, look, we have all of these functions. Can you add a function to search for an item by name? Now it's using the context of this file that we're looking at, and you can tell that because if you scroll to the top, it says used one reference. So it's a bit more explicit in chat about what it's using for a reference, and it said it's using basically the code that's on the screen, so 12 to 35. If I wanted to use all of it, I could either just highlight it and ask that same question again, and it will use, just stop it from scrolling. Oh, no, it needs to finish. It's using 1 to 44 because we've said this is the context that I care about. We've highlighted all of that text. And it's given us a suggestion. Now that suggestion rewrites the entire class. So I could highlight all of this and then paste it, or copy it all and copy and paste it there. Or I can just say apply, and it will actually use Copilot Chat to do the application to apply it to what needs to be added. So it's just added system, and it's added this function down here. So I can accept these changes right in here. So let's accept that. And it's applied those changes. All right. So I'm just going to quickly check for comments just to make sure I'm covering everything that people want. So it knows the subject context from the other files in your project. Yeah, it generally looks at other open files in your project as a priority. The actual method by which it gathers information to send to the Copilot server is proprietary. They work on that on a really constant basis. There's constant experiments about how better to, to give more appropriate context. So for example, they may do an experiment to say, well, do we get better results in C# if we only send the function names, or if we look for files in the same folder and send those function names as well? That kind of experimentation means that we have slowly climbed that acceptance rate higher and higher, which means that we're giving more and more appropriate code. Person who asked what would happen if you give Copilot a file full of comments. I did that. I wrote a full working code C# in the SQL. Yeah. And so why can't it take into context multiple files instead of just the file you're working in? So it can. So it'll take into context other files that you have open. But the reality is there is a limited context window. So you can't send everything up. You can only send a subset of information. And so we build that information with a priority on the file you're looking at. But we also look at other open files primarily. So it uses some more context. You can also be more explicit about that. So if I wanted to say, the same question, can you add a function to, for an item to search by name using if I hit hash, I can say, the visible code in the active editor, or I can specify another file. So I could say using, the products function API. And so that explicitly tells Copilot that this is relevant code that I want you to look at as well. This is a relevant file. A few people have also mentioned workspace. So as well as the hash, which lets you kind of specify more context explicitly for the question you're asking. So you can say a file, the selection, which is kind of implied in the context anyway, most of the time. The last command I sent in the terminal, or the selection in the terminal, or even like the VS Code API. I don't actually know how to use that one, but I think you can specify things to do with like, what does the API in Visual Studio Code let me do? So if I was to say something like, how do I format the code in this file using the Visual Studio Code API, it knows to look at that documentation. There's also, as well as the hash, there's an @ symbol. So the ones that I have access to a few more than most people, but Workspace, everybody should have access to if you have Visual Studio Code and Copilot. Workspace includes the context of the entire workspace. So I mentioned that I'm a developer advocate, so it's been a little while since I've actually written much production code, and so I'm at my desk at home a little while ago, before Microsoft Build actually, and I've been given a code base and asked to do a demo about using a particular library or a particular feature of Copilot to write some new functionality. And so I'm not like a Node developer, but the project I've got is just full of Node. So it's got pages. There's the home page. There's that index.jsx. There's a bunch of stuff in there that I kind of recognize, but I don't know how any of this fits together. I've been asked to write some validation code, right? And I don't know where that belongs. Like, this is a new code base, so I don't know where to put that. So what I can do is ask Workspace and say, where is the validation code in this project? Now, what that's doing is it's doing a couple of round trips. The first one is deciding what workspace information to collect. So it knows about the entire workspace, and in Visual Studio Code, that is basically all of the files in that project that I'm looking at. So everything here, that's my workspace. And it's deciding what parts of that workspace to use. So it sends this file tree to the server and says, hey, here's a thing, here's the question. What are the files that are relevant for this question? Now, I don't actually know whether that happens on the server or with a smaller model on the client, but that's its first step. And then based on that question, it said, well, here are some files, here are 9 files that might give you the information you need to answer that question. So it's suggested that azure.yaml, the bicep file, license, next steps. And then it's also found these ones, validation helper and validation helper test.js. And so Copilot now has looked at all of those files. It's looked at my question and it said, okay, well, it looks like here's probably where the code is. It's even found, the tests. So if I click on that, I get this, it's a deep link into where that validation happens. So being able to navigate the code using that workspace tool is really, really handy. Now I'll talk about Copilot in .com soon, because that gives even more context. It gives the ability to, it gives you, or it allows you to index the entire code base. And so it has a much more semantic knowledge of how the code all fits together. But at its base in Visual Studio Code, you can say at workspace and ask it to, find things in the workspace, which is great for new code bases as well. All right. I'm just skimming the questions to see if there's anything else I haven't done. There's a question about, can we give Copilot chat system prompts like we did for Copilot for GitHub models? No, we do though. So there is a lot of kind of system prompting that happens in the background, and we modify that all the time and experiment with that all the time, but we don't expose that. So you can't say something like, every time I ask for a function, make sure you add a function header in this particular comment format. That's not something we currently expose to you. You would have to explicitly say that. Copilot account with Microsoft, is that the same Copilot AI that's deployed in GitHub? Concerned about having to pay additionally for that service. So I think somebody's already answered this, but GitHub Copilot is a separate product from all of the Microsoft Copilots. So Copilot's kind of the generic term for an AI helper. GitHub Copilot was kind of the first one that came out. It took a little bit of retraining for me, but it was originally just called Copilot, and so we could refer to it with Copilot. But that name, because it's such an effective description of what it does, has been adopted not just by Microsoft actually, but by a bunch of other companies. So Copilot being this helper, a Copilot as opposed to a pilot. So the products are all different. GitHub Copilot is a separate product than Copilot for, and I'm going to get the words wrong because I work at GitHub, but Copilot for Teams or for Microsoft 365 and things like that. All right. There's a question or a comment. There are some neat Copilot extensions coming like Azure to ask about Azure development or resources deployed in your environments. And yes, that's true. You might have noticed when I hit there are a bunch of other ones. So there's Workspace, VS Code. So I can ask questions about Visual Studio Code capabilities. I'm going to ask you to ignore some of these. Some of these are little trial ones as well. Models is interesting as well, because this is that tool that I showed you earlier. So are there cheap are they cheap completion models? And so I'm asking a question of another service. This is, we call it kind of an agentic pattern. So it uses agents to provide more information that is not provided out of the box. So GitHub Copilot itself doesn't really know anything about GitHub models. There's nothing built into the training data or into that GitHub Copilot stuff to tell you about that. But we can go out to another model to say, hey, to another agent to say, hey, can you give us this information as well? And so it's given some suggestions. These are the cheap ones. These are 5.3 mini, 4K, 128K. Meta Llama, it says, is relatively cheap. And then, their capabilities, limitations, what to consider and stuff like that as well. It's also, and this isn't new, I haven't seen this before, but it also asks if it can read our active file and suggestion to give more specific, information about those questions too. These agents as well are not just ones that we build. There's ones, I think there's a bunch of extensions for Octopus Deploy and Sentry and a whole lot of other partners as well. So these are GitHub Copilot extensions. And you're able to build these yourself if you get onto the, I think it's still in a private beta at the moment. But it means that you could provide extra information using that kind of agent pattern. The one that is coming really soon is GitHub. And so this allows you to do things like search the internet. So I could say something like, what's the latest version of, and it will go out, it uses the context because it always does, but it's searching Bing for the latest results. So it's given the latest, supported version or latest available version of .NET 8. Now, this is something that's not really built into that training data necessarily. This is using another service of going out and searching for Bing, searching Bing to find that information. I can also do things like, because I'm in a repository, I'm looking at code that was cloned from a GitHub repository. I could say things like, are there any open issues for this repo? And this means that I can ask questions of GitHub using Copilot without leaving the context of the work that I'm doing. So it said, yeah, here we go. There's actually 2 open issues for the repository. There's one for adding formatting support and one to update the product page. I could say, are any of these issues assigned to me? And it will use that conversation that we've had before, but also use the GitHub, the GitHub extension essentially, or agent to say, here's the one that you want. And if I was to click on that, it would take me all the way to that project, specifically to that issue. All right. Paula asks, can your queries use code in multiple repositories as a basis for your answers? Not here. So I'll show you a little bit of that in with Copilot for github.com in a sec, because there are ways you can do that. But in the context of Visual Studio Code and Copilot Chat, it uses the workspace that we're in right now. You could, I think, just gonna see. I think this is just using the files that are available in the workspace. So I was just wondering whether I could go and look for files outside. I don't think I can. But yeah, it uses the context of that workspace. I'll show you when we look at Copilot in github.com how you can give that information. And then future plans for GitHub Copilot for use with the GitHub mobile app. Great question. Sometimes I have a problem knowing what stuff is public and what stuff isn't. When I open the GitHub mobile app, I have a Copilot logo in there. So that might give you a hint if stuff's not being officially released yet. But the general goal with GitHub Copilot is to put that AI capabilities anywhere where it makes sense to have it, anywhere where it can help you as a developer. So that's not just in the editor. Like, developers only spend about 25% of their time writing code. It's also things like pull requests and the issues that you're looking at and the command line. So I think I said that I have the terminal here. Let's just close this to give us some more room. I think I have the GitHub extension. There you go. So I can actually say GitHub Copilot suggests find all the .cs files in this folder. And it's using GitHub Copilot in the command line to say, help me find the command that I need, because this is somewhere else that I am as a developer. So that generic shell command said find .name CS. I'm in Ubuntu here as well, so that should work. So I can either copy it, execute it, revise it, explain it, and so on. So we're putting Copilot anywhere where you might be working. So that could be mobile, it could be pull requests, it could be any of those places as well. All right, let's just quickly jump back into the slides just for a minute. Copilot chat in github.com is something we announced a while ago. I'm just going to play that video. This is the ability to write in the browser, ask some questions that use kind of additional information from either your repository or from a knowledge base that your organization has, or something along those lines. And I'll demo this. I'll show you what it actually looks like. It means that it kind of gives you the ability to talk to your code base without having to clone the repository, but also more information that is relevant to doing your job. Like in this case, how do I design a responsive layout in Primer? We're specifically looking at Primer documentation. So Primer is well, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was originally a design framework, I think, or a style framework, and it's become more of a kind of component library. So it's a way of kind of that Copilot is built. Sorry, it's a framework that Copilot is built on, the front end of Copilot is built on, and it's open source, so you can use it as well. But because we've given it that additional context, again, we're all about giving appropriate context, it can give more information because it knows about Primer. We've given it that information. Yes, a good comment from Chris is that there is more coming at GitHub Universe, so expect a lot more. All right, so that's Copilot chat in github.com, and I'll show you that in a sec. The other one, which we announced a little while ago, was Copilot extensions, and we saw a little bit of that. The Azure extension is one that we've shown publicly before. Sentry has an extension, Octopus Deploy has an extension. There's a bunch of other partners who have extensions that mean that you can talk to GitHub Copilot and ask questions of your other services and your other tools. Now, ultimately, you should be able to write your own extensions for this too. So if you're using an internal application, one day you'll be able to write an extension for GitHub Copilot and use it in your organization to say things like, using our own proprietary ticket tracking tool, is there anything open for me? And not have to leave that context of either the editor or the browser that you're in. Now I'm going to show these things first before I just talk about this last item. So this is the browser. Here is the repository that I was actually looking at. So this is the Contoso admin application. And Copilot is available here too. So I can chat with Copilot about this repository or about some other ones. Now, I've gone ahead and indexed this repository. So it has this kind of knowledge of what the code in here looks like. So if I was to ask similar questions just in github.com, like, is there validate code in here? Then because it's indexed that code base, it can give more contextually correct information. So it's even telling me what it's searching for. So it's searching for, validation is valid, things like that in this repository. And it's found these ones. So what we can do is say, here's validation helper. I can deep link into that and it will take me to that file. I can even do things like, using this selected, let's just collapse that a little bit, or using this file, ask Copilot about that file. Now, what that's done is it's added that additional context to say we're chatting with that attachment, that validation helper. I could add other files as well, like let's add the validation helper test file as additional context and say, are we testing everything here? So right from the editor, giving it appropriate context, and this again, prompt engineering 101, we're giving it as much information as we can to be able to respond to that query. So it says, look, recent changes, validation helper includes things based on the recent changes. All key functionalities in that are covered by tests here. What happens quite often is that people will submit new code and then not have tests for that code. So being able to just ask, hey, are there enough tests to cover everything that we're looking at, can be really handy when it comes to navigating that code and working out what to do next. Now, I mentioned, let's just start a new conversation. I mentioned that you can, in Copilot chat in .com, you can ask questions of kind of other code bases as well. So not so much code bases, but there is a concept of knowledge bases. So what you're able to do is if you have a repository of documentation or markdown files or something like that, you can use that knowledge base as an attachment to give more context to the question you're asking to. And so this is a similar kind of thing. It uses a RAG pattern, so retrieval augmented generation. So first it looks up relevant information in those knowledge bases, and then it pulls that back. So we actually have some like GitHub engineering knowledge bases that we use internally. So I could say something like, how would I add a feature to this project? And it will give me an answer. But that answer is related to the code that I'm looking at, especially. It's related to this repository because we're talking to this repository. And it's given some suggestions of this is what you might want to do. Implement these feature flags. Here's some environment variables. Just doing a C# one as well. So it's given a generic answer. I'm just going to go back to the head here. But if I was to say, ask that same question, but give it a knowledge base, like our GitHub engineering knowledge base, and say, how do I add a feature flag to the feature? Because I've given it that extra context, it's now looking at these 8 repositories where feature flags are, feature flags probably feature. I'm trying to use a different word for that, but you get what I mean. But it's used this additional context to say, well, here are some useful resources. Heaven is kind of how we do our production deployment. It's just like an internal name. There's a feature flags overview of the delivery org. And then there's a bunch of other resources. So this is looking up our organizational code base and documentation to explain a little bit more about how we do things internally. So again, we're providing some more context. All right. A couple more questions. Paula, what is the cost for individual dev, and do you pay for extras like specifying a particular model or extension and so on? Do I get any additional power savings from having a GitHub Pro account? So the GitHub Copilot product itself is charged separately from the GitHub account. So you can get access to GitHub Copilot for individuals, whether you have a free GitHub account or others, but there is a charge for that as well. If you go to github.com/features/copilot, that should tell you, I think. There will be a pricing here somewhere. I'm generally like really bad with pricing because, there we go. Generally really bad with pricing because I work at GitHub, so everything is free. So that's the product and then additional add-ons. So GitHub Copilot starts at $10 a month. And then Copilot for business is organization controlled, and that's a little bit more. It allows you to do a few extra things, basically, and control people's access to it and whether it will supply code that matches other public code. Enterprise gives you additional things like the code and being able to index your code bases and things like that. So there is an additional charge for that for these ones. Right. Could I do a search through repository issues to verify an existing issue that hasn't been created for my problem or enhancement directly? Current search is very rudimentary. That's a great question. I'm going to try it. So one of the other things that Copilot Chat can do, as well as just looking at code, it can look at issues. So I could ask it to summarize this issue for me. I haven't tried this, and I'm going to guess that it won't work because, Ryan, you've mentioned that that this is something you want. But is there an issue for an error on the sign up page, for example, and just see if it can look through the existing issues? Because I haven't actually tried this. I've used it for summarizing long issues. There you go. No issues specifically mentioning an error on the sign up page in the repository. Interesting. So unable to use the GitHub API. Yeah, so I'm not sure whether that's given a good answer. Let's ask that again with one that we know. Is there an issue for rich text formatting? And see if it gives us something there. But ultimately, it can talk about it can talk to issues themselves. Yeah, there you go. So it's not actually doing a great job of that at the moment. It's worth mentioning that all of these are kind of under continued development, so they're getting better and better. But if I was to do something like open this issue and see there's a big long discussion about what that should be in, and say something like, can you summarize this issue? Because I'm looking at a specific issue on the page, I'm again providing additional context. So it says, all right, here you go, here's the summary. It's open. It was created by Martin, assigned to me, and there's a description of it. Was there a decision made about a library? I left the spelling mistake in there just to prove as well. This is a large language model, so it doesn't actually need you to be entirely accurate. There you go. Does not mention a decision regarding a library. So that's something that we would have to decide when we did that implementation. Copilot in .com also appears in a bunch of other places. So for example, there is a pull request that's open at the moment. And I can say in that pull request, ask Copilot about that pull request specifically. Let's look at what's changed and say, well, here's some changes here. I can ask Copilot about the diff specifically and say what changed here. And because, again, we're providing the context, we're in a location where we can, give additional context to Copilot. There we go. It's somehow been blocked by our GitHub content policies, which is a good way of talking about the difference between individual and business and enterprise. There are some policies that have been implemented by the GitHub organization, which is where I obviously get my Copilot license from. And that policy has blocked that response. I can try rewording because I don't know what it was saying that would be blocked. But let's see if that comes up. Using the results of that. Oh, yeah, sorry, because I didn't give it the specific file. Actually, can I do this? No, I can specifically say description file. And then again, once again, giving it context. It's all about context. As much information as you can give it, the better. So recent changes, it did this. So because we're on that page, we're looking at the file, we're looking at those changes. We've given Copilot, ask it about this specific diff and this revision 7 of that file. We're giving it as much context as we possibly can. So at the moment, if Copilot is not giving you what you want, whether it's in the editor or in .com, it's a great technique to just be able to say, here's some more information, can you try again? And that, as you use Copilot more and more, you start to get used to what information and how to ask questions to get better and better results. So whenever I hear somebody say, I've used Copilot, it's never given me the result I want, I always wonder what context they have given it. Have they opened a blank file and named it and then put in a comment without giving it the additional context? So you can build on that context as you go, whether you're writing code or whether you're in the browser asking it to do some more information. Now that is kind of explicitly giving it context, and that is kind of the best way to control what Copilot gives you. But we are working on more and better ways to implicitly decide what context is relevant to Copilot with that question. One of the things that it's just recently gone into limited public beta, this was a blog post from like a day or two ago, was fine-tuned models, which is now in limited public beta. So I think that means you can sign up for a waitlist. But if you go to that URL, it gives you information. And so this is kind of a next step in being able to fine-tune what Copilot gives you by giving it appropriate context. But in this case, the appropriate context is your organization's code base, or the relevant part of your organization's code base. So if you have a .NET project or a .NET shop, and there's a specific way that you build your .NET projects, if you are able to give Copilot the information about how you build your projects, how things are structured, what libraries you use, and things like that, that's one thing. And right now you have to do that kind of explicitly, or point to other code bases, point to knowledge bases, or get it to index the code base and ask those questions. Fine-tune models allows you to kind of fine-tune the trained GitHub Copilot model behind the scenes on your own code base. So just out of the box, you'll start getting suggestions that are more aligned to the code that you specifically have in your organization. And you can choose the repositories that get used in that fine-tuning as well. So how your team interacts with Copilot suggestions, your unique coding environment, and things like that. So it's almost like a custom Copilot that knows much more about your code base. All right, just before I go to the last little bit, I'm going to check on some questions more. Does GitHub Copilot have framework-specific knowledge? So if I ask a question in a WPF project, does it use that knowledge? Kind of, yes, in a couple of ways. So one is that if you are looking at files that clearly indicate that this is a WPF project, for example, or you have import statements at the top of that file, that additional information gets sent as context. And because GitHub Copilot was trained on billions of lines of publicly available code, that it's going to find, or it's more likely to find, responses that align with the context you've given it. So does it know exactly about WPF? No, but the training data does have a lot of information about WPF. So similarly to when we said, can you reply like a pirate? It knows what that pirate language is because a lot of that was in the training data. Similarly, if you've given it context to identify that this is a WPF project, the response is going to come back more aligned with WPF as well. Now, I say that knowing that the team is experimenting constantly with how Copilot gathers that context and what it does with that context. So one thing that I've heard suggested before is if you have a node project and you're importing a particular really well-known library at the top of that file, it would make sense for us to pull information from the documentation for that library to give you more and more accurate results. Now, whether they do that or not, I don't actually know. But I can imagine that being a thing as well. It knows you're in a WPF project, so it can use documentation about WPF to help give you a better and better answer. So yes, the underlying model should have training data for that. And then, all right, easiest way to submit feedback on Copilot, for example, submitting enhancement requests and all. Yeah, that's a very great question. Probably the best place to leave any feedback is on a GitHub discussions. So if you go to, I'm not going to remember this, GitHub, let's just do a search, community discussions. This is kind of a forum, essentially. It uses GitHub discussions, which is a feature of GitHub as well. And if you come down to Copilot in the product categories, there are a bunch of questions from people about Copilot. You'll notice that like the most helpful people, for example, a lot of these are GitHub employees. So it is very actively monitored and used as well. So if you have a question, you can just post something there, and the responses are pretty good with this this one as well for giving feedback. Yes, another suggestion by Chris as well is that the suggestions that you get do have an up and down arrow. So I don't know, validate Australian. And so I think, is that on here? I don't know. Maybe it's not on here. Yeah, I thought there was an up and down button for suggestions as well, but maybe I'm wrong. Unless Chris knows exactly where they are. In terms of like the editor though, when you accept it, that does give feedback. This is kind of this is a good response and this one isn't, because we do track those. But I think it's probably in the browser that Chris might have been talking about, where if you get a response, the up and down buttons are there. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so there is an up and down with chat. Actually, it might be chat in the editor as well. So yeah, you can say, this is a good response, this was a bad one. Cool. All right, I want to mention one more thing, and I don't have time to demo it, but there is plenty on the web about this, which is GitHub Copilot Workspace. So Workspace is a thing we announced at the end of Universe last year, or showed off at the end of Universe last year. It's currently waitlisted, so you can sign up for the waitlist for this if you want. And it's basically taking that process of getting AI to help you write code a little bit further by allowing you to start with an issue or a task and then doing a lot more of the kind of work for you. So you are still in control all the way through this process, but it means that when you have an issue, you can open it in a workspace and it will build a specification that you can edit, you can change, you can modify it, you can ask for changes in natural language. And then when you're ready, you can get it to generate a plan, and then from that plan, build actually implement some of the details. And I thought this video was much longer, and it's not. So you know what? I'm just going to do it anyway, live. It's always a good idea, right? So we've got this issue here. Let's say update the product page to make description a rich text field. It's got a bunch of information in here. I can open this in a workspace, and using its knowledge of that code base, because we've indexed that whole code base, as well as, zoom in a bit, as well as the information in that issue, it's built a specification. So this is the current state, this is the proposed state, and I can change any of this. I can add details, I can make changes however I want. I can even ask for changes in natural language to say, this isn't quite right, can you change this to this? And then it'll generate a plan based on that, the files that need to change and how they need to change. And again, I can add to this. So I can say, I also want you to put in the README, add details about the rich text. And that will get added to the plan of what to do. And then when I'm ready, I can ask it to implement those files. So this builds the code changes. So it's kind of like letting Copilot take a little bit more of the reins. Now you'll notice that at no point in this was it just doing stuff blindly. This code won't be applied. I have full control over what actually gets committed. And in fact, I can, make the changes directly in here. I can say that should be actually 200 pixels. And I think if I want to, Copilot can actually add information, or Copilot is available in there, or maybe that's an experiment that I haven't turned on. Not sure. Anyway, so I have full control here. I can look at the entire file explorer, see what's changed and where. I can add new files to it. I can make all of those changes, and I can ask for specific revisions of those files as well. So, make the height 250 pixels. So I am in control of all of this, and I'm kind of working much more with the AI rather than letting it do the work for me. Now this is under continued development. You can try it out if you add yourself to the waitlist. And then when I'm ready, I can create a pull request with those changes. I can even generate the description of what the changes that have been made too, which is quite cool. And yeah, this kind of takes it a little bit of a step further and speeds things up even more. So that's definitely worth looking at as well if you're interested. All right. Cool. I'm going to leave that one alone, Paula. So one little question about what's coming that I keep getting. The best way to find out what stuff is coming is just to keep an eye on the blog, but also we have a team inside GitHub called GitHub Next, and they're kind of our R&D department. That's where GitHub Copilot kind of originated, and they do a bunch of experiments, not just with AI, but with a lot of different tools. And techniques and things to try and improve that whole life cycle of a developer's day to day. And so this is where a lot of experiments come from. So check out githubnext.com. The other thing I would definitely say, GitHub Universe, to make sure that you're kind of up to date with all of the feature releases and things like that. That is the very end of October, and githubuniverse.com is the place to go. I am very quickly running out of time / have gone over time. I just want to say, if there's one thing you take from this, it's all about context. Any of these generative AI tools, the more information you can give it, the more context you can provide it, the better the results are going to be. So if you're not getting the results you want, open another relevant file, or add some more detail to the comment, or go to a specific file that has that implementation, or specifically say in chat, hey, go and look at this file for some more context as well. So it's all about context is how you're going to get the better and better results from GitHub Copilot. We have had questions all the way through, but here's a couple of links that should help. There is a blog post, a really good blog post, Copilot Prompt Engineering as well, which is kind of walks through a bunch of stuff. Sorry, it's not a blog post. It's actually in our documentation about how to kind of get better results from Copilot. You can also go to github.com/features, and that will show you some of the previews that are available as well for these things too. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and thank you so much everybody for coming. Feel free to reach out to me. I am Damo Visa basically everywhere, but you can search for my name. You should be able to find me relatively easily. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks to Damien for a fabulous session. To learn more about this series, watch past episodes, and register for future sessions, you can follow the link at the bottom of the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can also find that link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 23470, and we will see you at the next one.